What if the very moment you were chosen, truly chosen, lifted above everyone around you, was the moment your destruction quietly began? Not because success corrupts, not because power is evil, but because you were never really sure you deserved it. There's a particular kind of person who walks into a room and needs to be the most important one in it. Not out of arrogance, exactly, out of terror. The terror that if they're not at the top, they don't exist at all. And here's the uncomfortable part. Most of us have felt that, in some version, in some room, on some ordinary Tuesday. What we're about to examine isn't just the downfall of an ancient king, it's the anatomy of a mind, brilliant, gifted, terrified, and what happens when that mind mistakes its title for its identity. 3,000 years ago, in the hill country of Benjamin, a young man named Saul stood a head taller than everyone around him. That wasn't metaphor, it was fact. He was physically striking. The kind of person who turned heads before he said a word. And when the ancient nation of Israel demanded a king, the prophet Samuel looked at this man and said, "This is the one." Saul was chosen not from a royal dynasty, not from wealth or military genius. He was a farmer's son, humble, even reluctant. When the time came to be publicly announced as king, they found him hiding among the baggage. That detail matters. He stepped into power uncertain, not performing humility, genuinely unsure. And for a time, that uncertainty looked like wisdom. His early reign showed flashes of real leadership, military victories, moments of restraint, a kingdom taking shape. But the world Saul governed was unstable at every edge. The Philistines were a constant, brutal threat. His authority was still new, still contested. And prophets, not kings, held the deepest spiritual authority over the people. Then a young shepherd arrived at court, a boy, really, dark-eyed, gifted with a sling and, as it turned out, with something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with military rank or years in power. The crowds began to sing about this boy, and something in Saul shifted, something cracked. To understand what happened next, we need a framework. The one that fits here with uncomfortable precision is narcissistic collapse. Now, before that phrase closes any doors, this is not about vanity. It's not about selfies or self-promotion. Narcissistic collapse in clinical psychology describes something far more fragile and far more tragic. A person whose entire sense of self has been constructed around external validation, around being seen as special, as chosen, as the most important one in the room. When that external validation is removed or threatened, the psychological structure doesn't just bend, it fractures. The psychologist Heinz Kohut called this narcissistic injury, the wound that occurs when the self, having been built on admiration rather than internal security, is suddenly confronted with the possibility that it is ordinary, replaceable, less than. For Saul, the entire architecture of his identity was built on one foundation. God chose me. He was the anointed, the selected, the singular. And then, slowly, undeniably, it appeared that someone else was being chosen instead. That's not just a political threat. That is an existential one. The wound beneath the crown. The song is the trigger. After David kills Goliath, the giant Saul's entire army had refused to face, the women of Israel pour into the streets singing. The lyric is simple, almost casual, almost innocent. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. One line, sung in celebration, and Saul hears it. Now, a psychologically secure leader hears that song and feels pride. Pride in his army, his kingdom, the young warrior he mentored. The victory belongs to Israel. The numbers are just poetry. But Saul doesn't hear it that way. He hears a verdict. What the song triggers in Saul is what psychologists call narcissistic injury at the core level. Not a wound to his pride, but a wound to his ontological security, his sense of being someone, his certainty that he was the chosen one. The fear beneath the fear was this: what if I was never really enough? That question had likely lived in him since the day he hid among the baggage, and now, for the first time, the world seemed to be answering it. When the ego has been built on being exceptional, the emergence of someone more exceptional isn't just competition. It feels like annihilation. And the mind, desperate to survive, begins to reframe the threat. David is no longer a loyal soldier. He is an enemy, a usurper, a conspiracy. The paranoia has begun. The architecture of envy. What unfolds over the following years is not impulsive rage. It is something far more psychologically revealing, a gradual, escalating pattern of obsessive threat monitoring. This is the hallmark of narcissistic collapse in full motion. The mind, convinced that a threat exists, begins organizing its entire reality around that threat. Every act of David's loyalty is reinterpreted as cunning. Every success David achieves becomes evidence of conspiracy. Every person who loves David, including Saul's own son Jonathan, his own daughter Michal, is reclassified as a traitor. This is what cognitive psychologists call confirmation bias operating inside a persecution schema. The mind has decided on its conclusion. David wants to destroy me, and then filters all incoming information through that conclusion. Evidence that contradicts it is dismissed. Evidence that supports it is amplified. But underneath the paranoia runs a deeper pattern: envy. Not the ordinary envy of wanting what someone else has. What Saul experiences is what the philosopher René Girard described as mimetic desire, a consuming, destabilizing envy in which the other person's very existence feels like an indictment. David doesn't just have more. David's existence suggests that Saul's legitimacy was always conditional. And here is where the pattern escalates. Saul begins throwing spears, literally. He hurls a javelin at David, not once but twice, in moments that can only be described as the body doing what the mind cannot consciously admit. I want him gone. He sends David into impossible military missions, hoping the Philistines will do what he cannot bring himself to do with his own hands. He assembles armies to hunt a single man across the wilderness. This is not strategy. This is an ego in free fall, burning everything in its path to avoid facing the one truth it cannot survive. Someone else was chosen. And maybe I was never enough. There is a moment, dark, strange, and psychologically devastating, that marks the true breaking point. The night before his final battle, Saul disguises himself and visits a medium, a woman who can speak to the dead. He has outlawed such practices himself, and yet, here he is, desperate. He asks her to summon Samuel, the prophet who anointed him, the man who first told him he was chosen. What Saul is looking for in that dark tent is not prophecy. He is looking for reassurance. He needs Samuel, the voice of divine authority, to tell him it's not over, that he's still the one, that the kingdom is still his, that the identity built over a lifetime has not crumbled beyond repair. In Jungian psychology, this moment represents something profound: the complete collapse of the persona, the mask, the public identity, the curated self we present to the world, and the eruption of the shadow. All the denied fear, the suppressed inadequacy, the buried grief of a man who spent years running from the possibility of his own mediocrity. What Samuel tells him shatters what remains. The kingdom will be taken. Tomorrow, you and your sons will be with me. Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with terror. Not anger, not defiance, terror. Because in that moment, without his throne, without his title, without the external architecture of chosen one, there was nothing left. The collapse was complete. What we refuse to face consumes us. The tragedy of Saul is not that he failed. It's that he never once turned inward to understand why. Every psychological framework we apply here points to the same root. A man whose identity was entirely externally sourced. His worth came from the crown, from the title, from being selected. When those things were threatened, there was no internal bedrock to return to. No secure sense of self that could say, I am more than this position. And so the entire psychological energy that could have gone into growth, into self-examination, into humility, into genuine leadership, was redirected into defense, into hunting David, into protecting a throne that was already, spiritually and psychologically, already gone. This is what psychologists call self-defeating behavior loops operating inside narcissistic injury. The very actions taken to preserve the self accelerate its destruction. Saul's persecution of David did not protect his kingdom. It consumed his sanity, fractured his family, alienated his military, and left him alone in a tent talking to ghosts. The consequence was total. Not because God abandoned him, though the text says that, but because he abandoned himself. He abandoned the possibility of becoming someone whose identity ran deeper than a crown. He died the next day on a battlefield, wounded, surrounded, asking his armor-bearer to run him through. The last act of a man who had spent years trying to destroy another, and succeeded only in destroying himself. This story didn't stay buried in antiquity because it's about one ancient king. It stayed because the pattern is everywhere. Consider the executive who has built a 20-year career around being the smartest person in the room. Then a younger colleague arrives, sharper, faster, better with the new tools. And instead of mentoring them, instead of evolving, the executive begins subtly undermining them. Finds reasons to question their work, starts treating competence in another as a personal threat. Nobody announces this dynamic. Nobody names it. It just quietly poisons the team. Or consider someone in a relationship, romantic, familial, doesn't matter, whose sense of self has always depended on being needed, being the strong one, the caretaker. And then the other person starts growing, starts becoming more independent, more capable. And the response is not pride, it's panic. Followed by control. Followed by sabotage the person would never consciously own. Or think about social media, where the architecture of identity is built entirely on external metrics. Followers, likes, reach. And when someone in the same space starts gaining the audience that was yours, the psychological response can be disproportionate, irrational, almost feverish. That's Saul throwing the spear. Different weapon. Same psychology. The common thread in all of these is this: an identity that cannot survive comparison. A self that was never built from the inside out, only propped up from the outside in. And when the external props shift, the whole structure becomes dangerous, to others, to themselves. We call it insecurity. We call it ego. We call it jealousy. But what it really is, at its clinical root, is a person who never learned that they were enough without the title. Here is what Saul's story ultimately reveals, not about ancient Israel, but about the architecture of the human mind. We are fragile in proportion to how much our identity depends on things we cannot control. Title, status, being chosen, being first, being celebrated. These are not wrong desires. They're human ones. But when they become the foundation, rather than the decoration, of who we are, we hand the keys to our psychological stability over to the world, to the crowd, to the song they're singing about someone else. Saul had every external qualification for greatness. And what undid him was not his enemies, not David, not even the Philistines at the end. What undid him was the question he could never bring himself to sit with. Who am I, if I am not the chosen one? That question, left unanswered, became his shadow, and his shadow became his fate. The story of King Saul has survived 3,000 years not because it's a cautionary tale about a bad king. It survives because it holds up a mirror to the part of every ambitious, gifted, frightened human being that would rather burn the world down than admit, I was never the thing I thought I was. And the question it leaves us with quietly is this: what would you do? Who would you become if the thing you've built your identity around was suddenly taken away? If this kind of psychological archaeology speaks to you, if you're drawn to the idea that ancient stories carry modern diagnoses, then subscribe. Every week we go deeper into the minds that shaped the ancient world and what they still reveal about ours. The mirror is always there. The only question is whether we're willing to look.